So 55 years ago today, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the landmark Voting Rights Act into law. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that because you know what, as we head towards the presidential election in November, COVID and some of the other issues facing us in 2020 are really sort of presenting some new challenges when it comes to our election and voters expressing themselves. So we want to bring in CBS News political contributor and Democratic strategist Antjuan Seawright to discuss where things stand today. So Antjuan, usually we have you on here talking about politics, but we're going to sort of try to steer away from, Democrats versus Republicans and just talk about how profoundly impactful this act was. It has been called perhaps the most important piece of civil rights legislation ever passed. Tell me about the way that this act changed this country.
Well, it changed this country because it gave consequential constituencies, i.e. people who look like me, the opportunity to participate without having to answer the question, how many bubbles can you get out of a piece of bubble gum? How many marbles are in a jar? Can you recite the Constitution? Can you tell me the misspelled word on the piece of paper that was intentionally placed that way in order to deny you your right to vote? It changed the game in that regard. But before the Voting Rights of 1965, there was a lawsuit by George Elmore in South Carolina in 1946 that gave African Americans the opportunity to participate in the all-white Democratic primary, which opened the floodgates for our participation. Fast forward to tape, you had the march on the Selma Bridge from Selma to Montgomery, which I think, in my personal opinion, adjusted the temperature for Johnson to sign the Voting Rights Act into law. And so here we are today. It changed the game. It changed the country. The unfortunate thing about the signing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, some of the same challenges we dealt with in 65 and 46 are some of the same challenges and hurdles that Black people still have to contend with today as we try to do what we should be able to do.
Yeah, that's very true. And let us talk about the Supreme Court decision in 2013 that really had a significant impact. So in 2013, the Supreme Court's decision led to the lifting of certain oversight that had been placed on states that had had a record of disenfranchising certain voters. Let's talk about that decision and the fallout from it moving forward.
Well, let's take a step back for a second, Anne-Marie. After the historic election of Barack Obama as the 44th president of the United States, you saw the floodgates open with voting laws that were essentially voter ID laws that would essentially limit and sometimes cases take away the right to vote for people who look like me, minority voters. Fast forward the tape to the 2013 Supreme Court decision, which essentially gutted the Voting Rights Act, in my view, because it took away Section 4, did not bother Section 5. It took away Section 4, would essentially handicap Section 5. As a result, over 1,000 polling places closed around the country. Early voting opportunities were limited, and there were legislatures unleashed a real problem on the minority participation when it comes to elections. And that happened all across this country, but it started in the South. And so that's why I always overemphasize the importance of the courts being on the ballot every single election. If you remember, that was a 5-4 court decision that came down.
And I think, part of the reason why it's important to mark this day is that, people will associate the ways in which a vote can be frustrated, if you will, with sort of laws, like you pointed out, like, laws that may be voter ID laws or, the ridiculous laws, or, requiring people to, like you said, count how many pieces of bubble gum are in a container or whatever. But increasingly, what we are seeing are not so much laws, but policy shifts that have an impact on people's access to the ballot box. Whether it is diminishing the number of polling stations, and so when you do show up, you have to wait in line for hours. And, if you don't have the kind of job that allows you to wait in line for hours, you have to leave. Or if you physically, as we're seeing now with the coronavirus, can't stand outside in the hot sun, then you will leave. And so now it's not about laws on the books. It's about these other subtle ways that people find their vote being taken away from them. Right, Antjuan?
And Marie, after 2013, remember, we saw an uptick in voter purges. We saw polling locations closed in predominantly African-American neighborhoods and communities. We saw precincts being combined and notifications did not go out. So when people show up to the place they usually would cast their vote, those locations are no longer there. Sometimes the polling place would be on the other side of town. It is simply a rehearsal of what my sharecropping grandparents in rural South Carolina went through when they were trying to participate. We saw so many things happen. We saw poll tax implemented in Florida, but thankfully we've seen people fight back and we've seen people understand the fact that these things are happening. And I always remind people, if our vote did not matter, meaning people who look like me, there would not be people fighting so hard to take it away. That's why we have to participate in this little democracy. That's why we have to show up in spite of all the challenges we may face. Voting rights, access to the ballot box was the most consequential issue of my grandparents and great-grandparents' day, who were just a step above slavery as sharecroppers. And unfortunately, it is the most consequential issue of my day. And if we're not careful, it will be the most consequential issue of generations to come.
And let's talk about the November election, right? COVID-19 is not going anywhere, so the expectation is that there will be a large increase in the number of people voting by mail. Now, the president and some others have, raised the alarms about the possibility of fraud, which everyone who's sort of an expert in this area says fraud is not the issue. But mail-in ballots, there are issues with mail-in ballots. And we saw during the primaries that, particularly here I'm not in New York right now, but in New York, a significant number of primary ballots were disqualified for various reasons. They came in after the primary date. There wasn't a signature on it. They weren't postmarked. All sorts of things had happened. In fact, I do believe there's a federal court in New York that has basically told them that you need to go back and count those ballots. But if that was a dress rehearsal for November, I don't know if we're ready.
Anne-Marie, you know what? To hell with all the distractions that come around trying to paint this picture as if voting by mail is a fraud or anything. I'm old enough to remember the largest case of election fraud happened by the Republicans in the North Carolina 9th Congressional District in 2018, in which ballots were stolen and taken, particularly in predominantly African-American communities. So this idea that voting by mail, which, by the way, we've been doing for a very long time, we just call it absentee vote, has been going on for a very long time. And the truth of the matter is, Black voters in particular, with this pandemic is disproportionately impacted, or unfortunately, because of the president and because of some of the rhetoric, are having to choose their health or even life or death in casting their vote. But it will not be the first time Black people have put their life on the line to vote. As they say in my neighborhood, we've done it before. We'll do it again. We're not new to this. We're true to this. And so we can play this game and go through these mental exercises or mental gymnastics about vote by mail. At the end of the day, it should not be this complicated. It's not a Democratic or Republican thing, Black versus white. This is an American thing, and we all should have access to do it freely and fairly.
So, you say that it should not be this complicated, but I'm going to go back to the primaries and the problems that we've seen with just people, perhaps not understanding all that's required for a ballot to be considered valid. Yeah. I worry that because, and yes, voting by mail is not new, but the volume is. I worry that just the infrastructure is not prepared, and we're watching, lawmakers on Capitol Hill go back and forth about funding for all manner of things, and I don't know if they are recognizing that we need funding so that we can have a successful election in November.
Anne-Marie, you know the adage, show me your budget, I'll show you what you value. The bottom line is if lawmakers, particularly those who may not be in the same party as me, would prioritize free and fair access to the ballot box, that means the resources that come along with making this a reality will help this cause. That means making investments into education and outreach, because we know there are people who are going to have to be educated on this process. It also knows, meaning putting funding in so we can have the necessary number of people to make sure that everything flows and goes very smoothly. That's not anything short of just making the right call, which will in turn make the right investments to making these things a reality. But we can't do it at the ninth hour and expect the 10th hour to be okay. It has to be done strategically. It has to be done early, but it has to be done with true intent of free and fair access to the ballot box, a reality for everyone.
Very well said. Antjuan Seawright, always a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.